با سلام و درود خدمت هموطنان و همزبانان عزیزم، خیلی خیلی خوش آمدید. دومین پنل تحت عنوان مولانا در آیینه اندیشه ها برگزار خواهد شد. همونطور که گفتن من شهره آسمی هستم. افتخار این رو دارم که در یک همچین جلسه پرباری بتونم هماهنگ کننده جلسه‌ای باشم که چند تا از استادان بزرگ ما به نام ما در این جلسه شرکت دارن. جلال. بله حتما بفرمایید.
من خیلی عذر میخوام. من فکر می‌کنم آقای سروش دباغ به طور مستقل سخنرانی میکنن، بنابراین گفتم ایشون رو وقتی که سخنرانیشون میرسه معرفی بکنم. دوستان به من گفتن نه آقای دباغ هم در همین پنل هستن، ایشون هم لطف کردن و به ما افتخار دادن، از تورنتو تشریف آوردن آقای دباغ نازنین و خیلی عذرخواهی میکنم که من حواسم نبود که شما هم در این پنل هستین. خواهش می‌کنم.
بله، خیلی خوشحالم، افتخار این رو دارم که هماهنگ کننده این جلسه هستم. نام سخنرانا رو قبلا معرفی کردن. من هم مجددا اسم سه سخنران عزیز و گرامیمون رو خدمتتون عرض خواهم کرد. آقای دکتر احمد کارا مصطفی هستند، دکتر آرش نراقی و دکتر سروش دباغ که اگر اجازه بفرمایید قبل از سخنرانی هر کدام از این عزیزان من یه معرفی کوتاهی خدمتتون خواهم کرد از ایشون و خواهم گفت که تحت چه عنوانی سخنرانیشون رو ارائه می‌کنن. منتها یکی دو تا مسئله هست که من باید خدمتتون عرض بکنم. هر سخنرانی 25 دقیقه وقت صحبت داره و اگر سخنرانای عزیز به من اجازه بدن که من جسارت بکنم 5 دقیقه قبل از اتمام سخنرانی یه نوتی خدمتشون بذارم که یادآوری بکنم 5 دقیقه آخر رو خدمتشون بگم که بتونیم زمانبندی رو به طور درست ادامه بدیم. منتها تصمیم گیری بر این قرار شده که هر سخنرانی که صحبتشون تموم میشه اگر کسانی سوال دارن، افرادی در بین جلسه هستن همراه با کاغذهایی که شما لطف میفرمایید سوالاتون رو روی اون کاغذها مینویسید، به سخنران میدن که در آخر جلسه هر سخنرانی 5 دقیقه متاسفانه وقت دارن. متاسفانه از این نظر میگم کاش که بیشتر وقت بود و بیشتر میتونستن به این قسمت بپردازن. 5 دقیقه فرصت دارن که به سوالها پاسخ بگن. بنابراین من از سخنرانان گرامی دعوت میکنم، خواهش میکنم تشریف بیارن سر میز. خواهش میکنم بفرمایید هر سه سخنران. بله خواهش میکنم. دکتر کارا مصطفی که من الان معرفی کوتاهی خدمتتون از ایشون خواهم کرد، به زبان انگلیسی سخنرانی خواهند کرد و سخنرانیشون تایتلش هست Speaker, Voice and Audience in the Qur'an and the Masnavi. من یه معرفی خدمتتون از ایشون میدم و تقاضا میکنم که سخنرانیشون رو شروع کنن. دکتر احمد کارا مصطفی متولد ترکیه و استاد برجسته گروه تاریخ در دانشگاه مریلند است. او در سال 1987 از دانشگاه مکگیل کانادا فارغ التحصیل شده است. حوزه تخصصی دکتر کارا مصطفی تاریخ فرهنگی اجتماعی قرون میانه و نو در سرزمین‌های اسلامی در منطقه خاورمیانه و آسیای جنوب غربی است. کارا مصطفی همچنین متخصص تئوری و روش‌های مطالعات تاریخی است. دکتر کارا مصطفی مطالعات گسترده‌ای نیز در حوزه تصوف و سیر تحول تاریخی آن دارد. کتاب اخیر ایشان با عنوان دوستان هنجار ستیز خداوند در ایران ترجمه و چاپ شده و مورد استقبال قرار گرفته است. کتاب دیگری که در همین زمینه در سال 2007 توسط او نگاشته شده با عنوان تصوف روزگار تکوین در ایران به طبع رسیده است. کارا مصطفی در این حال در سالهای بین 2008 تا 2011 به فعالیت‌های اجرایی چون مدیریت بخش مطالعات ادیان در دانشگاه واشنگتن در سنت لوئیس و معاونت بخش مطالعات اسلامی در آکادمی آمریکایی ادیان نیز پرداخته است. بفرمایید. خواهش می‌کنم.
خیلی ممنون. سلام به همگی. بنده هم مثل سخنرانان عزیز دیگر مایل بودم که سخنرانی رو به فارسی انجام بدم. متاسفانه مهلت کوتاه بود. فرصت این که سخنرانی می ترجمه بکنم به فارسی نداشتم. اینه که امروز سخنرانیمو به فارسی ارائه میدم، انشالله که به انگلیسی به انگلیسی ارائه میدم، انشالله که مورد استفاده شما قرار بگیره. Now I have the difficult task of taking you from the heights of the sama of music, of poetry, and of dance to the more mundane sama of just listening to scholarly prose. So you have to bear with me. It is well known that there is a special relationship between the Masnavi and the Qur'an. The bond between the two is most popularly epitomized in the lines that are affixed to title pages of lithograph copies of the Masnavi. من چه گویم وصف ان عالی جناب، نیست پیغمبر ولی دارد کتاب. مصنوی مولوی معنوی هست قرآن به لحظ پهلوی. How can I describe that eminent personage? Not a messenger is he, yet he has a message. The spiritual Masnavi of Mawlavi is the Qur'an expressed in Pahlavi. That Rumi himself saw a strict correspondence between the Qur'an and the Masnavi is not a secret. The evidence for this view is both conspicuous and extensive. The Arabic prefaces to the different books of the Masnavi are particularly revealing in this connection. The preface to the first book, for instance, which is literally replete with direct Quranic references, is quite explicit about spelling out this correspondence. I'm quoting. This is the Masnavi, the roots of the main tenets of theology regarding the unveiling of the secrets of certain knowledge and union. It is the greatest creed and the most luminous of holy laws, as well as the most manifest of proofs of God. His light is like a niche in which there is a lamp, from the Qur'an, that shines more brightly than the dawn. This book's the paradise of hearts with boughs and springs, one known as Salsabil, another Quranic reference, by travelers on this path. To those with mystic stations who know miracles, it is the very best of stations and of resting places. Qur'an again. The godly here both eat and drink. They feel joy, the free feel joy and mirth through it. It is, like Egypt's Nile, a wine for patient worshippers, but an affliction for all Pharaoh's people and those who don't believe. As he has said, God, quote, many he leads astray by it, while many others God will guide with it. It is the cure for breasts, the purge of sorrows, the Qur'an's unveiler, and a vast profusion of man's sustenance and purest qualities. And it is written by the hands of noble pious scribes, another Quranic reference, who in this way ordain that, quote again from the Qur'an, none shall touch it but the purified, a revelation from the Lord of the both worlds. So you get the point here that basically in this preface, which is interwoven with Qur'an, you get a flavor of what the Masnavi itself is like. It is going to be totally interwoven with the Qur'an. Similarly, the preface to the third book, the Daftar, cites the following Quranic verse with explicit reference to the Masnavi. Inna nahnu nazzalna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun. We ourselves have sent down the reminder, which is normally understood to be the Qur'an, and we will protect it. As we will see shortly, the Persian text of the Masnavi itself is enriched in what may be called strategies of establishing correspondence between the Masnavi and the Qur'an. However, Moving beyond the text of the Masnavi itself for the moment, we can observe that the equivalence Rumi saw between his own composition and the Qur'an continued to be cherished in Mevlevi circles after his death, as confirmed by the following report in Aflaqi, in his Manaqib al-Arifin, who died in 1360, 87 years after Maulana. Quote, "It is also transmitted that one day Sultan Walad, Mawlavi's son, said, 'One of the companions complained to my father. The religious scholars were disputing with me, saying, why do they call the Masnavi the Qur'an?' He replied, meaning Sultan Walad, 'It is the commentary of the Qur'an.' After a brief moment of silence, my father said, 'Why is it not the Qur'an? Why is it not the Qur'an? Why is it not the Qur'an? Just as there is nothing contained in the vessels of the words of the prophets and the saints, but divine lights, and the words of God have sprung up from their pure hearts and flowed forth upon the streams of their tongues.'" The Persian goes, همچنان منقول است که روزی حضرت سلطان ولد فرمود که از یاران یکی به حضرت پدرم شکایتی کرد که دانشمندان با من بحث کردند که مثنوی را قرآن چرا میگویند. من بنده گفتم که تفسیر قرآن است. همانا که پدرم لحظه خاموش کرده فرمود که چرا نباشد؟ چرا نباشد؟ همانا که در ظروف حروف انبیا و اولیا جز انوار الهی مدرج نیست و کلام الله از دل پاک ایشان رسته بر جویبار زبان ایشان روان شده است. The words of Rumi, as reported by Aflaqi, are certainly enticing as an explanation of why the Masnavi was called the Qur'an. But even if we accept Rumi's claim that the discourses of the prophets and the friends of God are on a par with one another, and that they are all equally of divine origin, such an assumed univocality of saintly and prophetic discourse can hardly explain why it is only the Masnavi that is singled out for its Quranic features, and not any other verbal outpourings of divine wisdom from the mouths of some other Persian-speaking friend of God, of whom, thank God, there is certainly not a shortage. Clearly, rather than taking Aflaqi's report, or for that matter, Rumi's own claims at their face value, we should attempt to develop our own understanding of the alleged equivalence of the Masnavi and the Qur'an. So, in this short talk, I look into the special relationship between Rumi's spiritual couplets and the Qur'an as seen through the prism of speaker, voice, and audience. Admittedly, this will be a limited exercise, not sufficiently expansive to cover all the different aspects of the problem at hand, but I believe its benefits will nevertheless be obvious. So let's start with the Qur'an. Voice in the Qur'an. Let us start with what appears to be a simple question. Who is the speaker in the Qur'an? At first glance, the answer to this question would appear to be straightforward. According to Muslim belief, the speaker in the Qur'an is God. Yet upon closer scrutiny, it emerges that while it may be possible to work with the assumption that the Qur'an is the speech of a single divine speaker, we cannot help notice that this speaker resorts to nifty identity shifts and regularly speaks through different voices, much as any author or poet would do. I will venture a generalization at this point and say that there are two predominant types of authorial voice in the Qur'an. An impersonal, seemingly detached voice, and God's direct speech, which is personal and engaged as well as engaging. The impersonal voice is comparable to certain modes of the narrator's voice in fiction. It is indirect, in the sense that it does not address the audience in a personal manner. but its very indirectness lends it a certain categorical and authoritative aura, and it works its magic through this very quality of being taken for granted by the audience. When the speaker of the Qur'an assumes this voice, the voice is understood to issue forth from the very source of authority itself. In fact, the very source of speech as well as of everything else in existence. As such, pronouncements in this authoritative voice are not, and not to be, questioned by the audience, and they form the wider canvas on which the speaker of the Qur'an gives voice to an intricate series of speech acts. The second voice of the voice that the speaker of the Qur'an assumes is the personal voice. The personal voice is direct, interactive, affective. The speaker in the Qur'an achieves such intimacy not only by speaking in the first person, often in the plural we, but remarkably also by referring to himself in the third person, God, he, as well as by adapting a relational perspective when he frequently refers to himself as Lord, or even more intimately as your Lord, thus reminding the audience, including Muhammad himself, of his relation, of his status in relation to them. It is important to note that the speaker does not remain bound to any of these two modalities of what I'm calling the personal voice, and switches freely back and forth between the first person and the third person. Interestingly, both the impersonal and personal voice can be transposed to other speakers, without subverting the voice of the speaker of the Qur'an. When recited by others, the impersonal voice and the third person can easily take on the personal voice of the reciter. And the reciter could be Gabriel, could be the Prophet Muhammad, or Moses, or other reciters, and such as reciters even today, which leads to a fusion or confluence, or if one is unhappy with either of these terms, at least a meeting of the reciter and God. This is most significant, since paradoxically, God's voice is audible only through the medium of the human voice. This blending of the voice of the speaker of the reciter is a crucial feature of the Qur'an that I believe is at least partially reproduced in the Masnavi. But first, we should make a few observations about questions of audience in the Qur'an. So we started out by asking the question, who is the speaker of the Qur'an? And as speaking is normally construed as an interactive act, it is natural to continue by asking, who is the audience of the Qur'an? Indeed, who is being addressed by the recitation, which the Qur'an is? When viewed through the lens of this question, Qur'anic verses can be divided into two large categories. Those that are addressed directly and primarily to Muhammad, and those that are aimed at different categories of people, so divided according to their stance vis-a-vis God, i.e. believers, people of the book, hypocrites, unbelievers, and so on. It is tempting to complicate this picture somewhat by observing that, of course, all verses of the Qur'an are directed at some level to all of humanity, even if the implications for this statement for any given human person or community remain too specific to inform our current discussion. This assumption of the possible relevance of the Qur'an to every individual and community undergirds both the Qur'an's seemingly limitless reach and its accessibility to all kinds of human audiences. In any case, it may be beneficial to adapt the viewpoint of the listener at this stage and note the following features of the reception of the Qur'an by its audience. First, the recitation, I'm using the recitation to refer to the Qur'an, the recitation is responsive, relational, and contextual, in that God is responding to circumstances, occasions, asbabun nuzul, on the ground as a living voice, according to how people are oriented towards God. Second, the recitation comes across as being simultaneously authoritative and personal. Third, the recitation is perceived to operate with an unusually strong aesthetic power. Here we can also note some other following features of the Islamic revelation, which are also directly pertinent to the question of the Qur'an's audience. The revelation is conceptualized as a sending down from the source of authority. The mode of revelation is oral, in the form of a recitation, directed at a specific audience. The revelation is made in the vernacular Arabic of the time, as opposed to a sacral language which people can't understand. By the way, in Iranian history we have a direct experience of this in the Zoroastrian Gathas and others, which at the time they were being recited before Islam were incomprehensible to regular speakers of Persian, because they were too archaic and arcane, but it was a sacral language. The revelation is piecemeal in that it is spread across 2 decades. In taking stock of our observations of the Qur'an, I would like to suggest that the most striking characteristic of the Qur'anic event, as viewed through the prism of the issues of speaker, voice, and audience, is, and this is underlined in my text, is the dynamic interrelation between the speaker and the audience as mediated by their different and multiple voices. I read that again. The dynamic interrelation between the speaker and the audience as mediated by their different and multiple voices. The normal assumption of God as a remote speaker, fixed in nature and identity on the one hand, and various categories of human beings as audiences parceled into unchanging socio-religious identities on the other hand, simply does not survive close scrutiny of the way the Qur'an functions. Yes, God is the speaker of the Qur'an, but as we have seen, he assumes different voices, shifting from one to the other quite unexpectedly and precipitously. Any reader of the Qur'an will know exactly what this is about. Along the way, he also lends his voice to numerous human actors by incorporating their speech into his own, and in so doing speaks through them, even to the extent in numerous instances of addressing himself and others in their voices, most notably in prayer-like verses, like that of Surah Fatiha, the whole of it, or the last verses of Surah Baqarah, the second verse, or in verses that start with the command, say, Qul, that are normally addressed to Muhammad. The speaker of the Qur'an is, in other words, is difficult to pin down or freeze or fix. For their part, the auditors, the listeners, have a difficult time in positioning themselves vis-à-vis the recitation, since they not only have the challenge of adjusting to the shifting voices of the speaker of the Qur'an, but also need to situate themselves with respect to those voices, which can be a very trying task. Additionally, there is the difficulty that Quranic categories of people are never strictly translatable to social groups. Categories like believers, peoples of the book, unbelievers, hypocrites, idolaters, etc. hover over actual social reality, much like analytical categories that we scholars use in scholarship. With the result that any single person, any single listener is hard-pressed to fit himself or herself into any one of them. Am I a believer? Am I a hypocrite? Am I any one of these categories or neither? The result is a dynamic, interactive quality in the transaction that takes place between the speaker of the Qur'an and its audience. Remarkably, this sometimes even leads to a kaleidoscopic blending of identities, especially since ultimately God only speaks through the voice of a human messenger or a human reciter, whose voices are added to the divine voice as overtones. It is, I believe, this highly charged relational quality of the Qur'an that is reproduced in the Masnavi. So let's turn to the Masnavi and look at the issue of the voice. In Jessica's beautiful recitation of the beginning of the Masnavi, you've already actually seen shifts if you paid attention to how the voice changes. We start with a command, and then there is the first person voice of the reed flute, and then there is the categorical voice of the narrator for about 10 couplets. Then we switch to a direct address, ey pesar, and then there is the categorical voice again, another direct address, so on. But I will actually exemplify this later. Clearly, there are many different authorial voices at work in the Masnavi. The most obvious ones are the following. First, the narrator, mostly assumed to be Mawlevi himself, but sometimes highly impersonal and categorical, speaking in the third person. Second, we've got Rumi himself in the first person, but speaking in different voices and addressing different audiences. He assumes the voices of the commentator. By mine I have 7 minutes, but that's okay. He assumes I only have 2 more pages. He assumes the voices of the commentator and the preacher when he addresses the listeners, and that of the petitioner and supplicator when he directs his speech to God. He either speaks to the audience, or when he speaks to God, he becomes all of a sudden the supplicator, the petitioner. Third, at times the audience is not only addressed directly, but in the singular and the plural, and is also given the opportunity to speak, most notably during invocations and prayers when we join Rumi and pray together with him. And fourth, we've got the embedded voices of characters within stories and anecdotes. Such voices are highly transposable, often melding with one of the other voices that I listed above. So there's a lot of shifting. When we turn now to the audience, there are several different addressees that we can identify in the Masnavi. First, there is the listeners, either second person singular or second person plural. You in the singular or plural. Sometimes singled out by name, Husamuddin, someone specific. Or by type, awliya, saints. Or generically, ey pesar, ey pedar, something along those lines. Second addressee is God / ishq or love or haq. The third, Rumi himself, addressing himself. He talks to himself sometimes. And fourth, we've got fictional characters in the stories who are addressed and who address one another. Such listings of the different voices and addressees as I have supplied above hardly do justice to the dynamic interplay of speaker voice and audience that takes place when one reads the Masnavi or hears it recited. In order to probe very briefly the nature of this intricate embroidery of the speaker voice and the audience, let us briefly visit the story that I'm sure all of you know of the parrot and the merchant. In the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you the story, assuming that you all know it. But when you look at this story, we start with Rumi narrating the story. Then, for about 10 verses or so, the parrot begins to speak, addressing the parrots of India. Then we are in transition. Is it the parrot speaking, or have we switched to Rumi? Because at being addressed, God is being addressed, so there's a blending of voices. The parrot and Rumi begin to blend into one another. Then we switch to Rumi, the commentator, who comments among all this. Then the narrator steps in, picked up by Rumi, the preacher, who preaches. Narration immediately resumes after several verses, but Rumi, the preacher, comes back. Narration resumes, but merchant begins to bemoan and wail, which merchant's moaning turns into Rumi's bemoaning and wailing, addressed to God, and God, the beloved, answers. God's voice is implanted. And then we switch to Rumi, the preacher, Rumi, the petitioner, narration, preacher, narration, preacher, petitioner, preacher. That's the kind of a shift that takes place within a matter of essentially several hundred verses. Several features of Rumi's delivery here claim our attention. First, The multiplicity of voices with which Rumi speaks is indeed remarkable. Minimally, he is the narrator, the commentator, the preacher, and the petitioner. For the sake of completeness, we should add to all these the voices of all the fictive characters that populate the Masnavi, since on some level they too talk for Rumi. When the parrot is speaking, the merchant is speaking, Moses is speaking, they're also speaking for Rumi. Even more striking than the multiplicity of voices that Rumi adapts, however, is the fact that while these different voices of Rumi are clearly distinct, they are not mutually exclusive. Frequently they overlap and blend with one another. Rumi's transitions from one voice to another is often unpredictable, sudden, surprising, sometimes even surreptitious. And this is just like the Qur'an. This surreptitious appearance of the voice of the Rumi happens most noticeably when Rumi's voice, normally in the supplicator petitioner mode, emerges from within the voice of one of his fictional characters. This is the most beautiful part of reading the Masnavi, when one of the characters begins to pray, and then Rumi, it switches to Rumi, but we're never quite sure. In the story of the parrot and the merchant, such blending of voice and hence of identity takes place first between the parrot and Rumi, and later between Rumi and the merchant. One might think that the effect of such blending would be to destabilize the fictional characters and rob them of their efficacy as fictional actors. But in fact, what occurs is the exact opposite. And Rumi's voice energizes and animates these fictive entities and enhances their impact, the impact that their words have on the listeners. The result is that Rumi, the speaker of the Masnavi, like the speaker of the Qur'an, appears throughout the work as a forceful yet evasive presence, a distinct yet multivocal speaker who remains impervious to our attempts to catch and freeze it. Such multivocal dynamism by the poetic speaker of the Masnavi generates an equally dynamic and multivocal response in us, the audience. The tendency to assume an unchanging status as a disengaged listener or reader, interested only in the stories recounted in the Masnavi, is thoroughly destroyed only a few minutes into the experience. The auditor, the reader, the listener soon loses his or her bearings as a passive recipient of words and becomes a reckless traveler in search of an identity in that vast expanse of speech, and in lending an ear to the often cacophonous symphony of multivocality that is the Masnavi, she or he finds an opportunity to try out different voices and eventually to add his or her own voice to the concert. In the process, willingly or not, the auditor, reader, is transformed into a reciter, an actor in the drama sprawled by Rumi. You are totally pulled in. The magic works, and the audience is pulled onto the stage to participate in the play. Through the intricate overlapping of multiple voices, the interweaving of multiple voices, the poetic speaker and the audience are transformed into partners in an endless game of self-discovery through mutual borrowing and lending of voices. Such interaction between the speaker and the audience on the canvas of voice is, I submit, a primary reason why the claim that the Masnavi is the Qur'an in Persian ultimately rings true to our ears. Thank you very much.